So my name is Geremy Mumenthaler. I'm a design generalist and UX mentor. I do some mentorship at Career Foundry, so we're really excited that they're sponsoring this today. I was a former design director at the Noun Project, which you might know. And recently I did some work with some colleagues here from philosophy. I see a handful of people here. Wonderful, wonderful team over there. So Noun Project you might know for doing visual language. Today though, I want to talk about written language. I couldn't help though add a lot of visual icons into my presentation, so bear with me on that. Written communication can be attributed to some of the most important advances that humanity has. Being able to time travel your knowledge from one moment in time to the future through writing is an incredible advancement we've done as people. It's being able to extend past our lifespans. It's pretty powerful. Our entire understanding of the world and sciences, medicines, all of those things, all came from the collective knowledge of our past. And most of that came from written language. These achievements of life-saving medical procedures and sending people to the moon, all of that would not be possible without written language. Over time, as we develop new technologies for written language, we improve it in two ways. The first way is how it spreads, and the second is how well it's received or understood. And the technology that is invented is what really dictates how that gets improved. It focuses in on one of those areas or the other. So the technology I'm talking about are simple things, maybe, to us now, right? Writing in general, letter forms, pens, printing press, typewriters, computers, desktop publishing software, instant messaging platforms. These are the types of technologies and the way that they built on each other to expand the capabilities of the written word. And as we develop a new technology in helping writing become better, it starts with wanting to expand the reach or increase the speed at how people can access that writing. And then, once we get comfortable enough with that technology, we start to move into how we can improve the clarity of the information and knowledge being presented. So it starts with the speed, and then once we're comfortable with that expanding, we then focus on the clarity. Today, we can communicate almost instantaneously with anybody in the world, just about, right? Even if we don't speak the same language, there's technology that allows us to communicate with those people in like an instant. Yet, all of these impressive capabilities don't always address the clarity issue. They address the speed and the scope, like how far our knowledge can reach, but not necessarily how well it can be understood. So we're at the point of this cycle where we're really good at the speed part, right? Like we have the internet, all the instant stuff. The clarity is the part that we're not necessarily optimizing for. But this is a cycle. It kind of happens as a new technology gets invented. We go through that cycle, we make it faster, then we start to clarify what that means. So even with that, all of those capabilities, we still kind of run into things like this. I'm sure you've seen, these are very quick mock-ups of me trying to make bad Google Docs and emails and Slack messages where there's little care to the hierarchy of this information. I'm sure you've all gotten one of these from a coworker or something, right? You're like, Mike, or whoever it is, please just make this a little easier for me. We're using this incredibly fast way of sharing knowledge, and yet the clarity of what this information is isn't quite there. I see it every day. I sometimes send those, try not to. We're at this time where the knowledge transferred is totally appropriate. But again, how we can communicate that in the most clear way is maybe not understood by everybody. So let's take a look back to early humanity. The beginnings of written language started with proto-language. These are, iconography. It's pictograms, hieroglyphics. And those written languages transformed over time into more complex systems, roughly 1,000 years before we got to writing that would be more recognizable to how we communicate today. And as the techniques evolved over that time, also the systems of how we understood all of those techniques or technologies improved and was addressed. So as the technology gets us more capable, our understanding and our complex systems get more refined. But the only way to really capitalize on this time traveling that I mentioned earlier is if you share the workings of that system with the people in the future. If nobody knows what the system really is from the original writer, then it's going to be really difficult for us to have that clarity. The Voynich manuscript here, which I recently learned about, is it's a document that has a lot of writing in it that is using a dead written language, or an extinct written language even. And there's a good chance that we'll never know what the writer of this document was trying to communicate. We don't know. But the technology, as it improved for handwriting, things like inks and paper and pens, fountain pens, they made it easier to share those systems because we had some shared understanding of how it worked. That shared understanding allowed us to evolve our systems even more and focus on the clarity and communication of how the systems were addressing the needs of the knowledge we were trying to share. So pictograms and those proto-languages turned into transitional systems, and then eventually into phonetic alphabets, at least here in the West. And this allowed for an even wider range of the types of knowledge we could communicate with the future. And this is what gets me really excited. So all of these improvements helped build our collective knowledge. And unlike oral tradition, which is much older than written language, you can now extend your knowledge beyond much further through time and space than the oral traditions allowed you to in the past, which also makes it faster. However, when we had these manuscripts that were hand-drawn, handwritten, and they shared a language with a certain population, it took a long time for these documents to get created. If you've ever handwritten a letter, which is a very strange phrase for me to say to an audience because I feel like that's a common thing. The more and more I talk with people, the less I hear that they go, "Oh, when was the last time you really took a notebook and wrote out something?" And I feel like the Apple Pencil just doesn't count still. it takes a long time. These people must have had a terrible corporal call, copying these books and manuscripts to try to take the knowledge that they had at the time and propel it forward to build our common understanding of the world even better. Humanity really needed a more efficient way to spread that knowledge. So along comes printing. And printing unlocked the ability to rapidly exchange those ideas and that knowledge and in a much further reach, because you can put a book on a boat and send it across to a new continent. You know, there's still lots of challenges during civilization as it grew, but it was a much faster way than anything before it. Compared to handwriting with a quill and ink, or a brand new fountain pen that just got invented, right? The printing press, and specifically like movable type here, it was still pretty rigid of a system. So even though it allowed us to reach further, it limited us in how we were communicating that information. And the reason it limited us was based on the boundaries of that technology. Eventually, those constraints were then understood through that experimentation, like I mentioned a second ago, into systems and ways to understand and read the other content that was being created by other people. China had movable type around 1000 AD, but the West credits Gutenberg nearly 400 years later with movable type. He created one of the first known published works, or that's what gets in the history books at least, the Gutenberg Bible, 42-line Bible, and the name of this document is based off of the technology that created it, and this was cutting edge technology. This was, I'm in my head, imagine Gutenberg with like a turtleneck on stage talking about this Bible. It's amazing. One more thing is put in the drop cap. That was a Steve Jobs impersonation. But, the decisions of how this page looked, he was a designer, right? He's an inventor and probably a lot of other things we don't want to talk about, but he designed this page. He decided what ink went where and why and how to communicate things. And a lot of his decisions were kind of made for him based on the technology that he made, which was that printing press and the width, those 42 lines. All of that was part of the technology that then ended up as the way we understood how to read it. And in the 1450s, this might have been, wow, look at how clearly crisp all those letters are and characters, and I can just read it so easy. I think I read a quote while researching for this that said, people raved about how legible the Gutenberg Bible was, and it was because of technology, right? But today's standards, it was real hard to read, right? Like if I was doing a portfolio critique and I saw that something like this in somebody's portfolio, I would absolutely have some questions about it. Okay, let's talk about type choice. Why does it, great work on not having that many rivers for having justified text, which is really hard to do, and especially when you're hand setting each of those letters, and probably hand carving each of those letters before that. It's a masterful piece of work, but still, the clarity part was compromised because the technology was optimized for it to reach as far as it could. I love that the themes so far, we have our IA themes, but I feel like today we've been talking a lot about libraries and books, and it's so exciting to me. This is one of my favorite books that I keep on my desk most days. It's Robert Banghurst's The Elements of Typographic Style. And in it, he outlines hundreds of these typographic choices, which became typographic traditions. and ultimately technology in and of themselves, in ways to clarify the ways that that technology worked in order to communicate the ideas the best way. So just a couple of those examples. Well, first, I highly recommend you get this book and just keep it on your desk. I read it maybe once a year, once every couple years. It's really good. But things like adding minuscules, which we now call lowercase typically, but the term lowercase came from where in the typecase it was placed. I don't know if anybody's worked with letterpress before. I had a studio in Chicago where we did a lot of letterpress, and it was one of the best design exercises I've ever done. Getting all dirty, moving big pages, and spending hours and hours trying to just like kern these letters, and they fall out, and you lose an I, and you never have it again, so you have to like make one out of an L. It's complicated, but super fun. I don't think I'm selling that very well. But this is a new technology that got created based on the larger set. So the printing came first, and then we knew that, okay, all of this is very hard to read. Let's add some more dimension and do these minuscules and mascules and allow there to be more variation on the page for my eye to skim it better and improve the clarity of the information that I'm trying to pass to that future. That like time traveling aspect, these are some of the things that happen that really propel that. Another thing outlined in this wonderful, wonderful book is keeping line measures to readable width. So a line measure is, it's the number of characters in this line. But when you go too far, your eyes kind of get tired, and then you read and you go all the way back to here, and then it's like, oh, is that in this line or this line? And there's standards, and they're in this. And those standards came through years or decades or centuries, possibly, maybe even longer, of tradition in typesetting, and those traditions were created out of the restrictions of the technology that created them. So all of this stuff kind of feeds back into itself, but this is a lot of what we do in UX with buttons and colors and usability. And this is the usability of type communication. Ideally, you want it 66 for the record. So like, if you can hit 66 characters and then to the next, that'll probably be the smoothest read. And also just looks good. People do websites. Okay, can you just talk a second about Squarespace and how Squarespace just like lets you do a single line of your whole statement from edge to edge of and then people just do like 10 of those. Just bring it in 66. Make it like 3. We'll talk about it. If any of you want help, I can write up some CSS for you. So the advancement of printing technology and these typographic systems that came out of that technology, those traditions, this allowed humanity to build like they were never building before. We were able to leverage all of the information that was recorded before that moment and record what we were learning, put that back into kind of our collective knowledge in libraries and in institutions. And it propelled us into, for better or worse, where we're at today. And the more people who were able to use these books, this written text that was the past telling them about their experiences so they could learn, have a heads up and a higher starting point, everybody who was reading was now also somebody who could potentially be contributing to that system, and contributing to that knowledge. So the more people that wanted to participate in building that knowledge meant the more demand for ways to publish that. So let's jump forward quite a bit, but not everybody can have a printing press. Not everybody has the time, patience, or physical strength to lift a 10,000-pound machine into their home to write their novel, line by painful line. But typewriters were invented, and this gave publishing power to an individual. And then, computers and desktop publishing era, after that, really empowered people to publish themselves. But think about a typewriter, at least like what our typical typewriter looks like. Probably, I mean, this is very simplified, but we're making compromises on the clarity in order to have the reach. So instead of me handwriting everything, I'm typing away, which is a lot faster, and I can produce a lot more quickly, so I can get my screenplay out there or whatever I'm doing. But it's all typically the same typeface. You have restrictions in all sorts of ways. The wonderful thing about computers is that it not just allowed us to reach even further and move even faster, but there was a moment where we were able to have a lot more control over how that clarity was getting added to the information and knowledge that we were trying to share. So with typewriters, barrier was single typeface typically. You could change them out sometimes, but that was kind of later. And not a lot of ability to tighten up words. Everything's kind of monospaced, right? Apple computers really pushed and popularized the quote-unquote beautiful typography in desktop publishing. I don't know how exactly true this is, and there's some contesting stories, but Steve Jobs took some calligraphy courses in college. He ended up, dropping out of those courses or something, whatever Steve did. And that stuck with him, that idea of clarity, of really focusing in on the forms, the letter forms, and how those were communicating those ideas. And he was like, I want those in my computers. And as we know, the story of Apple is, it was like, okay, well, this is a really hard problem, but I guess we're going to do it because everyone wants us to do it. And they did. And it got popular because I think it helped people clarify the information they were trying to make. That led to having multiple fonts on computers, as well as proportional typefaces, which was a huge achievement at that point. And I'm skipping lots of technologies here, so you can definitely roast me in the comments, but that technology into desktop publishing transferred into things like HTML and rich text and Markdown. These are ways of adding clarity to that knowledge and information you're trying to share. So now we've got individuals who are contributors to this collective knowledge in a way that is, even less gatekeeping than before. And we can acknowledge the fact that there's plenty of other factors that said who and who wasn't contributing to that collective knowledge, but the technology was there. So I believe that humanity truly does have a lot to attribute all of the great things that we were able to do, the knowledge that we do have, and the places that we're able to extend beyond our own lifespans due to the written word. But with all of that ability, every day, like I said before, people write documents and they send emails and instant messages that are great at spreading the information, but not quite using all of that collective history in how to make it clear. So, for my sake, and for the sake of the future humanity that we're trying to speak to, with all of this document knowledge that we share and document and put together, when you're making a Google Doc, instead of just writing text, use paragraph styles. That's a title and a subtitle, and that's an ordered list. These are ways to use some of these traditions that Greenhurst documented in this book in our everyday life. When you're writing an email, instead of the big wall of text, you can use the traditions that we've learned over centuries and centuries of the written word to start to clarify what all this information means. And be really intentional with it. And kind of participate in this collective knowledge, even if this is just this. I send these to myself, so it's not this isn't going into the archives, but it's still important to clarify that information because the technology we have now, the spread is out there. We can move to the clarity now. And instant messages. I see things like this on Slack. I'm on a million Slacks. Slack all the time where I'm trying to say, is this a question, or is it a statement, or is it just a comment, or is it a quote from somewhere else? But being able to have a little bit more understanding of it through some hierarchy and that architecture of how that type is structured is really important. So be a good steward of this knowledge and participate in the tradition of the written word. In every time you put pencil to paper, or type on your keyboard, or any other way you're using these forms of technology to communicate with the future. I really appreciate your attention today, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. You can follow me at Jeremy Good and see my little design studio, Geremy.design. If you have any feedback on this talk or anything, Geremy.design/feedback. Thank you. 7 seconds for questions. Okay, we can do a couple questions. Does anybody have any questions? Great, it was nice talking with you.
Although it's not technically written text, how do you see icons or emojis really contributing to the future of the clarification? Do you think they're going to be used like in less colloquial situations like business, science, literature?
I hate to tell you, or I hate to spoil it, but they already are. It's verbal language. It has shared understanding. It has format and context and capability. And just like cuneiform or hieroglyphics, it can be used to communicate to other people. And that key part that I mentioned earlier was that you just need that shared understanding of what those marks mean. And in today's age, I think we have that shared understanding. For the future, who knows? There's a bunch of those types of pictographic systems that are less well documented in history that we don't really, like hieroglyphics is one, where it's like, well, we know a lot of it, and there's scholars who work really hard to understand it, but emoji is just another one of those. And it's actually a really highly regulated one, right? Yeah, so definitely.
Thanks.
Hey Jeremy, you mentioned some of the tools that we can use, like in that last slide. Why do you think people don't do that? I'm curious.
Yes. So this is where the part of my talk started, or like when I dove into research on this. Why I wanted to speak about this here today. I was trying to figure that out too, because Google Docs is the one that I use it a bunch. And I love styles. I'm like, I don't even change them, I just leave them as is. I'm like, okay, this is the title, this is H1, this is H2. I also do a lot of development work, and I'm a big fan of, a semantic, blanking on the word there, but you know the word I'm looking for, right? Semantic, thank you. Semantic text. So by understanding that, you can leverage it all the time. But I think people, this was a slide that I ended up leaving out. We need better examples. Google Docs opens up and it's a blank sheet. And I believe it's a blank sheet because people are used to word processors that have blank sheets. I've been using a tool called Notion lately, which is a wonderful kind of documentation type of platform. It's like a lot of them, there's plenty of them, but they do a really great job of making templates to take a type of communication and break it up into those ways so you can templatize it a little bit better. I think we just need more of that, and more shared understanding of the history of why we have those capabilities, why we have those traditions. I don't think we need to rewrite those traditions. We can expand upon them, we can add to them, we can improve upon them. But like we have plenty to leverage today. Yeah, don't get me started on hyphens and M dashes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
What about hyphens?
What about hyphens? I'll save all of you who didn't ask the question some time and say there's like a paragraph in this book, I'll let you look at it today, that explains really well when to use a hyphen, when to use an end dash, when to use an end, when to use an end dash. And these are, doesn't matter, in my opinion, as long as you're communicating ideas. You know, this isn't like a law book. This is a rule book. It's guidebook. It's typographic style, just like the Chicago style that was mentioned earlier, or any of the other types of writing styles. It's a way for us to better understand and use a shared way of communicating. So I'll let you look at it. And I think there was one other question in the back.
You mentioned Notion earlier, and it reminds me of like all the tools that we have that have these different types of like ways to organize information, like our Notes app and Google Docs and Microsoft Word. So I was wondering if you think all these different ways that these tools are educating users in a sense, if they ever have any conflicts or if they're all reaching like a common goal.
I believe there's a lot of work done on this type of thinking. The common goal that I think a lot of these platforms end up going towards is looking at specs like HTML. HTML is a very well-defined, well, we could argue about that one too, but it's a fairly well-defined spec that you know that it is an in spec or it is not in spec. And I think that platforms like Google Docs and Notion and some of these others look to things like established decades-old standards and specifications because they know that it would be easy for people who know those specs to then start using them in the new platform. So we have a lot of incentive to keep these traditions going. And the HTML specs were thought about and used a lot. I mean, there's a little bit of conflict in some of this. Somebody made elements of typographic style for the website, which I also recommend if you do any web development, which kind of translates some of the principles here to like CSS types of ways of manipulating typography. And there's absolutely conflict, but Gutenberg had conflict with his printer friends. They all did slightly different things, and over time, the ones that communicated the most clearly rose to the top and moved forward. Got documented. So we're always going to stray away from it, but as a whole, like that trend line is we're growing that knowledge. We're not necessarily convenient. So understand it, and leverage what we already know. If you can improve it, try to improve it, and then just advocate a lot for your improvement, so that way it can get adopted and survive. So that way, whatever documentation you do make doesn't end up being an extinct written version. I think that is our time. So thank you so much.